Police believe another lockdown protest is planned in Sydney this weekend after thousands of people gathered in Sydney and Melbourne last Saturday. Among them are far-right activists, QAnon conspiracy theorists and people feeling the economic cost of the lockdown. Dr Josh Roose researches radicalism and extremism at Deakin University and he joins me now. Thank you so much for your time. So this is a really disparate group of people that came together for the protests on the weekend. What's the motivation?
Yeah, it's a really important question because it is such a complex tapestry of actors. Look, primarily the common theme here is frustration, but also distrust in government. There's a strong feeling that the government have let people down, both economically but also politically. That said, there's also a wide variety of various groups that have contributed to these protests, and it's important that we know who they are and what they're thinking, and there's a much deeper seated animosity to the state.
How do these groups communicate? Like, how is this all arranged?
Look, it used to be that they would conduct their activities through social media and a lot of their recruitment as well. So the obvious, Facebook, Twitter. That's changed as these social media companies have slowly started to crack down on disinformation. We've seen them migrate over to encrypted messaging applications like Telegram.
Does that make it harder for authorities to find the messages?
Not necessarily, because the activities on Telegram are often public. You can observe in real time as the protests are taking place, exchanges of messages between activists and people protesting. But what is difficult is actually effectively getting in between and actually intercepting those messages between the key organisers, both nationally and internationally. And we've seen that these protests are occurring internationally at the same time.
How did Saturday's protests differ from, say, the Black Lives Matter protests last year? There have been probably progressives quick to condemn the protests on the weekend, but defend the action, the BLM action from last year.
Yeah, the usual narrative is that the BLM, the Black Lives Matter protests, were a progressive protest so that they were allowed, and these aren't being allowed because they're seen to be to the right of the political spectrum. It's not necessarily the case. I mean, what we saw at the BLM protests were people who were covering up, social distancing, an actual reasonably responsible march where people were actually obeying the guidelines. What we've seen here are people deliberately walking around without masks, deliberately disobeying the convention about social distancing, and if anything, actively spitting on police officers at times and media figures as well. So there's been a strong attempt by the protesters to basically rebel and to show defiance against the protests. So that's probably where the primary concern is, particularly when it could become a super spreader event.
You say that engagement is necessary, but how do you engage with so many disparate groups and ideas?
It's a real challenge because this isn't just about this. Well, what we see with these protests are that they're a symptom. They're a symptom of a much larger problem. It's easy for politicians to talk in negative terms about the protesters. I think most people feel that way in some way, shape or form, and it's easy to play to that. But the fact is that these protests have really started to pop up over the last 18 months, and they signify a much deeper seated discontent, not only about the impact of the lockdowns disproportionately on some segments of the community, in particular working people in precarious work, but also across multicultural communities, and there's quite complex geographic divides starting to emerge as well, both in Sydney and the way that the lockdown's being configured there, but also in Melbourne and the policing strategies being used. So it's important to understand that there's a really wide array of strategies that governments are going to have to do, not just to engage and win back trust, but in the way that they're actually conducting this entire operation.
There are further protests planned for Saturday. Can authorities stop it?
It'll be difficult to stop. I mean, it's pretty easy to anticipate that, given the reaction to the first round of protests, that law enforcement will be a lot more rigorous and vigorous in policing. And obviously, some people who might have been on the fringes of these groups might be turned away or put off by that idea. But the hardcore of protesters are actively organising on Telegram and other forms of messaging, actively talking about looking forward to the conflict and being involved and not caring if people are happy about it or not. So it's fair to say that they will probably attempt to mobilise, but the extent to which that will be successful is really waiting to be seen.
Josh Roose, really good to talk to you. Thanks for your time.
Thank you.